Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I've got another 6 album roundup for you guys, just some stuff I've been listening to for the past few weeks. The intent here is just to kind of give you something to check out, and maybe with the possibility of like putting out some hypotheses about these guys to investigate further for more detailed looks at this music. But a lot of good stuff this time around, so let's get it started. Starting off with Lindsey Buckingham's self-titled 2022 release just from this last year. Lindsey Buckingham, of course, guitarist from Fleetwood Mac, and probably, in my opinion, a real underrated genius in the field. I mean, many people, I think, probably can agree that they have a lot of respect for Lindsey Buckingham, but over the years, he's proved to me again and again that his skills as a songwriter, his skills as a guitarist, really are not, I don't think, as appreciated as deeply as they could be. He's up there, I think, along with some of the greats. And especially as a guy who's pushing his age now, roughly 71, 72 at this point, released this solo album, his 7th solo album, and shows he still has it. He's still got it. Lindsey Buckingham is a really viable, current album, but not one that tries to, of course, reframe what always made Lindsey Buckingham great. He's got incredible songwriting, of course. And of course, as I've said before, incredible guitar playing. When he steps up to the plate and plays guitar solos on this, you know it's Lindsey Buckingham. He's always had this extremely impassioned approach to his soloing, and very melodic aspect to his guitar voice that shines through here amazingly well. In addition to all these things, Lindsey Buckingham actually is a master, I think, of layers. And he gets a chance to really explore that a lot in his solo albums. And this really is obvious, I think, on this Lindsey Buckingham album. Now there are, again, some A-sides, I think, and some B-sides on this album. A few songs that don't quite, stack up to the brilliance of some of the others. But even the ones that are maybe less intricate than some of the more engaging tracks still have all of the elegance of an early Beatles recording, except with contemporary production and with, Lindsey Buckingham's obvious respect for what the Beatles did, turned up to 11 basically, so that the songs almost enter this almost orchestral realm, even though harmonically they're not terribly complicated. They have this really the sense of being huge, and to have these songs performed as they are will require a huge, incredibly big ensemble, and no part would be left out in doing it. So it feels like what the guy who wrote Holiday Road back in the 80s, what he would end up doing later. So it has a clear line between his solo career, where it started and where it's ended up at this point. Okay, next up I got DOMi and J.D. Beck's Not Tight. DOMi and J.D. Beck is a sort of a transatlantic jazz duo, with DOMi, the keyboard player, being from France, and J.D. Beck being the drummer. Both of these are very almost young musicians, maybe even thought of as child prodigies because they had started their studies very early and showed a lot of aptitude as far as their musical potential. And these two musicians have really dug into that and leaned into it and become, despite being, roughly 20, I think JD's barely pushing 20 and DOMi's like maybe 21 or 22, some of the best contemporary jazz that's out there. And this is jazz, make no mistake. I mean, despite what you see these guys and the image that they have, there's always that vein in jazz that allows it to be reinterpreted. And this is really in line with current hip hop standards and maybe even like, post 90s trap style drums. There's a sense that these guys could probably get together with Square Pusher and make a pretty interesting album. But in a more contemporary sense, they're also keying into these guys that sort of have been exploring this contemporary idea of jazz fusion, like Thundercat and Flying Lotus. Like, these guys have always had hints that they have a real respect for the 70s fusion, like Return to Forever and that sort of thing. And DOMi and J.D. Beck, I think, just sit right inside of that niche as well, and rides on that wave of those folks. And many of those guys make appearances on this album. they have lots of guest artists on this album. What I think is really amazing about DOMi and JD Beck is that they are a fully functional jazz duo, meaning that despite just being two people, they sound richly instrumented. DOMi is playing keyboards, but also very often playing bass with her left hand on a separate keyboard. And really, if you don't know that she's doing that, it really feels like there's a bass player there. She has a really good idea about how to navigate that bass voice and choosing bass sounds that fill it out and make it sound like an ensemble much larger than just two people. And you really can't mess with JD Beck's drums either. Super duper tight, super dry, and gives that really contemporary hip hop feel that you hear so much these days. Okay, next up I got Afrorack, the Afrorack. In Africa, modular synthesizers are not terribly easy to come by. You can't just go to a store and buy them. And very often, if you can get hold of them, they're terribly expensive due to shipping and just getting them out there. So this musician, Bamanya Brian, was really was an engineer and decided he would take it upon himself to wire and create his own modular rack. And instead of calling it the Euro rack, he's calling it the Afro rack. So this synthesizer album is really one that's made entirely from the ground up. Now you hear stories about African musicians making instruments out of found objects and things they find, but you really can't get much more DIY than wiring your own modular synthesizer and doing it in such a way that it really pulls off as convincing. The sound qualities and the kind of sounds that he gets out of them are phenomenal. I'm always fascinated by how contemporary African musicians use African traditions and African rhythms in a more contemporary, like especially electronic context, And this is another really great example of that. Sort of sits in the middle between where Hama, from a couple of years, Hama's Houmeissa, somewhere on that feel of the album, but kind of with a broader sound palette in some ways. Because Hama's disc was all about just this one synthesizer. And I think Afrorack is doing a lot more with a lot broader palette of sounds. Almost to the point where you get into what Venetian Snares was doing with traditional synthesizer music a few years ago, but without quite that kind of European take on complexity. The complexity you see here is more about texture and rhythm. So right in line with some of the things that are sort of trans-African musical characteristics. Next up I got Soul Glow's Diaspora Problems. Now, year's 2022. It really should not be a big deal to have a black rock band. It's certainly not like it was in the late 80s, where, Living Colour and Fishbone and 24/7 Spies and Bad Brains were reclaiming rock and roll music for the black voice. But here we are, 2022. Soul Glow is a post-punk, almost like thrash type group, with all black members, and so they really fight against that kind of tokenism very explicitly, especially if you watch this video where people are handing them these pamphlets that say Soul Glow sounds just like Bad Brains, and they're just running away from it like I don't even want to hear that. And of course, despite them trying to distance themselves a little bit from the sort of tokenized idea of black rock musicians, there is something that's sort of cohesive and interesting about when you infuse black voices inside of thrash type rock, even though it has its roots in the black voice. I think it's really cool to hear that now, and especially in a contemporary, post 2020 landscape where racial tensions are so high. And I think the Diaspora Problems is a really great take on what it's like for the contemporary black voice to travel through punk rock music and through thrash metal and come out on the other side, really making a social commentary, but also sheathed with an amazing musicianship. which Soul Glow definitely has. Is throughout the album also really has a top-notch musicianship and great songwriting and a variety of sounds that keep it from just sounding like a thrash album. And definitely, I think, also distances it from Bad Brains, those earlier black rock musicians whose style was just different because of the times that they were in. Okay, next up I got Skhivosani's unpronounceable album name. Although from the Georgian, if you put this into Google Translate and translate it from the Georgian that it's written in, it's pronounced Damczywski, I believe is what it says, which translates into burns. So if I'm going to refer to it the rest of this, I'm just going to call it burns. I hope that's acceptable. Skhivosani is the project of a musician from Georgia, the country, not the state, named Nicholas Treblinski. This is a Name Your Price album. It had been sitting on my wish list for a while, so I got it simply because I could afford it, and it was kind of a wild card release. And what really attracted me to it is the really great guitar textures on it. The lead track on this album has this really amazing, like skittering, tittering little guitar textures that are held down by longer melodic phrases. And it reminded me a lot of Sea Buckthorn, especially the first few Sea Buckthorn albums that were very connected with me very strongly a few years ago. In an attempt to kind of get back into that, I purchased the album, and by and large, I think it's pretty successful at what it sets out to do with its certain parameters. Works best whenever it's emphasizing this guitar voice, this sort of guitar textures. It's shimmering, brilliantly constructed, well conceived, and consistent throughout in terms of this texture. But we run aground a little bit whenever the vocals show up. Unfortunately, there's 2 or 3 tracks on here where the vocals show up, and the vocals just kind of tank a couple of these tracks. It feels like it's almost like a sad giraffe in a couple of them. And despite the fact that as soon as the music comes back in, it engages me back in, the vocals on it unfortunately kind of drag it down a little bit. But if you're just looking at the instrumental tracks, especially if you're a person that pulls things out for playlists, I would highly suggest checking a few of these tracks out because there's a lot of really amazing stuff happening, and it's very musically effective, I think, at what it sets out to do. And finally, David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, 1980 album from David Bowie. And I'm always kind of on the fence with David Bowie because I have so much respect for him. And I think that whenever David Bowie does things well, it is amazing. But I don't always think that he's super consistent on stuff. And this album in particular, I think, shows a little bit of an identity crisis with where David Bowie was headed. And that shows up from time to time because this is coming off of his kind of famous and influential Berlin trilogy of albums, where he's really pushing a very experimental side of his musical concept. But it hadn't done too well commercially. Any of those albums hadn't done particularly well commercially. So he was trying to go back and to hit something a little bit more commercial, which would probably end up in the big renaissance when he gets to Let's Dance a few years later. This is a first kind of step in that direction. And as such, it's a little bit of a schizophrenic album because the hits on this album are great. They are very noticeable and they stand out in terms of their polish and their concept. There's a few songs on here that feel a little bit more improvised, which is the take that he had on the Berlin trilogy. A lot of that stuff was kind of constructed in the studio as they went. So there's some songs on here that really sell, and there's some songs in here I think that feel a little undercooked. But when it does it well, this album really shines and shows some of David Bowie's best work. Especially the lead single, Ashes to Ashes, was one that I heard a keyboard part in this song that, even though I've heard it many times before, had never really noticed before. And it really made the whole thing for us. Boo, 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 boo. I tell myself I'll stay clean tonight, but the little green wheels are following me. Oh no, not again. I'm stuck with a valuable friend. I'm happy, hope you're happy too. One flash of light, but no smile. I also think for me personally, David Bowie might be always working at a bit of a disadvantage when I get into his albums, because my real introduction to David Bowie came around 1990 when he released his Changes Bowie box set. Now, I bought the single CD of Changes Bowie and I loved it. I listened to it a lot at the time. And I saw him on that tour, the Sound and Vision tour that he took at the time. But the problem is now I always hear the singles. When I listen to his albums in an attempt to get a bigger appreciation of him as an album musician, because David Bowie was a musician that made albums. Those songs always tend to poke out at me, and they always tend to grab my attention more. And as such, I tend to see them as more polished than others. So that may be just my perception that Ashes to Ashes and Fashion, those two tracks are songs that kind of grab my attention more because I'm more familiar with them. I know they're the singles, so maybe my ear is more drawn to them. David Bowie also is kind of a guy I think that you kind of had to be there for. He's so tied to a certain vibe of the 70s that if you didn't go up in the 70s following him at the time, it's very hard, I think, to go back and really recapture what he was doing, the zeitgeist that he represented in music and in culture at the time. You can still appreciate his music, but I don't think it has quite the same weight as it would have if I was following David Bowie as he was releasing these albums in the 70s. But that's all I got to say about David Bowie and the rest of these albums for this week. I really appreciate you stopping by to listen up. I'm making a year-long playlist with tracks from all of these albums, dating back all the way to the beginning of the year. That's over on Spotify, so go check it out under Dr. Spin. I'm also in the process of doing eliminations, heading towards the top 20 of 2022. We're really starting to refine things down. I'm posting those showdowns over on my blog and text, so go check that out if you have the opportunity. If you want to know when more videos are going to show up, please like and subscribe and share this one out with your friends. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.